Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Philosophizing with a Hammer. In this first introductory episode, we're gonna look at the idea, basically, behind this podcast. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about philosophy itself. Um, it's something that might seem abstract or even unnecessary in a fast paced and technology driven world of today, but I believe it's essential. I'm talking about the question, why do we still need philosophy today? And what is philosophy anyway? Because we cannot talk about why do we need it unless we define it first, because I think that it has lost its meaning throughout history and through time, especially in our current modern fast-paced society. To start with, philosophy at its heart means the love of wisdom. It's not only an academic field, but a way of thinking about life. To break it down, etymologically speaking, philosophy we have philo, which means love, and Sophy or Sophia, which means wisdom in ancient Greek. If you combine both, you have the love of wisdom. This term was famously coined by Pythagoras. Pretty sure you're all familiar with the name. And when we talk about philosophy, we're really talking about our desire to understand life deeply, to ask big questions, to be in love with wisdom, and search for thoughtful answers. Philosophers, and actually really all of us, at one point or another, I'm pretty sure, we have all asked this question. Questions like, what's true? What matters in life? How can we live well? Why do I have to wake up in the morning at 7 a.m. or 6 a.m. and go to work and be engaged in this endless rat race, a Sisyphean cycle? How the hell do I get out of it? And why am I into it? And what is life after all? Those big existential questions. I'm pretty sure we've all been there. And pretty sure we've all struggled to find an answer. And throughout history, people have been wrestling with these questions by trying to find some answers following some certain ideologies, most famously like religion. However, it's not always easy to find answers for these type of questions. When we dive into these big questions, it's like a big dilemma. It's like diving into the abyss. And I guess this is why we need philosophy. Basically to help us find some answers, or at least die trying. We're gonna look at philosophy from a perspective that we can all relate to in our today's world. So, why philosophizing with a hammer? I mean, as far as the name goes, hammer. Basically, it's a concept, a Nietzschean concept, in which hammer is made to break things, right? For Nietzsche, the hammer, well, it's about basically a way to break down old ideas and questioning long held beliefs. To Nietzsche, the hammer was a tool of not just for destruction, but for creating new ways of thinking. For, let's say, chiseling out the truth. It's about boldly examining our values, shaking off conventions, and finding our unique path in life. So, in this journey, we're going to explore what it means to live authentically in today's world by drawing down wisdom from the ancient philosophers who laid down the foundation for pretty much everything of what we think of today. Because I truly believe that time is constantly repeating itself, and if we don't learn from history, well, that's a big mistake. If you look back at history, it's all a cycle, a hermeneutical cycle that goes over and over and over again and repeats itself. The term hermeneutical cycle is actually developed by Schleiermacher. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Maybe Schleiermacher, maybe, I don't know. The German philosopher who talked about time and history as a way of being repetitive, but in a circle that expands over time. It was later on refamed by Hans-Georg Gadamer, another German philosopher who talked about how time repeats, and history repeats itself in a circular pattern. So notice the familiar patterns if you look at history. Societies, they rise and fall. Political movements, they surge and fade. And leaders, they come to power promising change only to be replaced by others who promise the same thing. Just consider how often we see the cycle of hermeneutics, of power and revolution, of constant repetition. If you look at it that way, why does this keep happening? Why do we keep repeating these cycles? We can look at an answer from Hegel. Hegel offers an interesting perspective. He saw history as a process of human consciousness developing through conflicts and resolutions. He called it the dialectic. Although some scholars actually did use the terms that I'm going to mention now, but it's the idea and the ideology that matters. So if you look at it that way, according to Hegel, society advances by moving from one idea or state, which is called the thesis, to its opposite, the antithesis. Okay? And then we try to combine both, and it's called a synthesis. So we have thesis, antithesis, synthesis. What is this? So thesis, for example, think about it this way. The government should have minimal involvement in the economy. Okay, this is an example of a thesis. This view supports the idea of laissez-faire, laissez-passer capitalism, where the market operates with little to no interference from the government. Now, proponents argue that the business should be free to operate without governmental regulations, right? Believing that market forces will lead to the best outcomes. The antithesis would be the government must intervene in the economy to protect public welfare. So this perspective opposes the idea of minimal government involvement, arguing that unchecked capitalism can lead to inequality, exploitation, and environmental harm, which advocates also that government regulation is necessary to ensure fair wages, protect workers' rights, regulate industries, and address issues like climate change and economic inequality. So you have two opposing arguments now, the thesis and the antithesis. How can we find the solution and the middle ground? This is where the synthesis comes into action. So the government, for example, should regulate the economy to ensure fairness and protect vulnerable groups, but not to the extent that it, let's say, intervenes or it stifles innovation and economic growth. So the synthesis combines elements from both sides, best of both worlds, basically. It acknowledges that some level of government regulation is necessary to protect the public and ensure equity, but also recognizes the excessive intervention which could hinder economic growth and innovation. A balanced approach is proposed where government action is targeted and address specific issues like labor right or environmental protection without overwhelming the market. Now, this is an example of the dialectical process described by Hegel, where conflicting ideas, thesis and antithesis, are resolved into a new and higher understanding, which is a synthesis. Now, through time, the synthesis itself will become a new thesis, because it's an idea now, so it's the thesis, and eventually it will result and lead to an antithesis, and so on and so forth. A hermeneutical circle. In other words, each historical conflict brings us a little closer to a deeper understanding, but only if we are willing to learn from it. Hegel believed that history could be a teacher, but only if we pay attention and see each cycle as a part of a broader journey. I like his famous quote, "The only thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history." This captures the frustration that many people feel when they see society fall into the same traps again and again and again. If we don't look back with intention to seek and to understand these patterns, we are doomed to repeat them. And to look at history from this perspective, we can clearly see a lot of political cycles that often echo past events. Let's look at, the Roman Empire, for instance. So it grew through a conquest, spread its influence, and eventually fell due to the internal corruption, economic issues, external pressures, etc., etc. And if you look at it that way, many historians actually do draw parallels from between Rome and modern superpowers like the British Empire or the United States, and they note similar challenges such as overextended influence, political division, and rise in internal inequality. The British Empire actually extended globally, often through economic and military dominance, only to face decline due to resistance from colonies and economic pressures as well. The US and other Western powers now face similar challenges as global power shift towards new emerging powers, the rise of the right. It's constantly, repetitive. We could look also at the example of revolutions. Let's look at the French Revolution, for instance, which arose from discontent with inequality, economic hardships, and the concentration of power, which itself inspired a wave of political and social revolutions across Europe, influencing later movements such as the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution itself inspired, the later socialist and communist movement, which globally illustrated a cycle of reform and a response to social inequities. Revolutions continued to gain inspiration from each other. You could look at the example of the Arab Spring revolution, a set of revolutions actually, which started in Tunisia in 2011, which saw protests across not only Tunisia to start with, but later on an influence to other North African and Middle Eastern authoritarian regimes. So while it was driven by demands for democracy and economic opportunity, several countries reverted to authoritarianism or struggled to maintain democratic system. This actually reminds us a little bit of what we discussed earlier with the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. It's a constant, repetitive change, a hermeneutical change. These examples perfectly illustrate how similar political circumstances tend to lead to familiar outcomes and cycles. Looking at this perspective, looking at time, at history from this perspective, we can clearly gain a lot of knowledge from ancient thinkers. We could truly still find their ideas highly applicable in our current world. And that's precisely what I hope to do here. We'll explore how philosophy, often seen as something ancient or academic, can be powerful, a living tool to help us in our everyday lives. From facing adversity with the Stoic resilience of Marcus Aurelius, to Aristotle's teachings on achieving happiness, to more thinkers that are still highly applicable nowadays, we aim to uncover how these ancient ideas can be applied in today's world. These philosophers didn't just speculate about life. They lived, struggled, and transformed. They explored love, courage, integrity, and, of course, the search for meaning in a way that remains incredibly relevant today. Philosophy isn't just about classrooms, dusty old books. It's a practice. It's a way to approach life. Ask hard questions and challenge ourselves. And today, with constant distractions, social pressures, rapid change, AI, everything, it's easy to feel lost or overwhelmed. And I believe that philosophy can anchor us, helping us cultivate a more authentic and resilient approach to life. What are you expecting from Philosophizing with a Hammer? Each episode will focus on a theme or a question that I think is especially relevant. Sometimes we'll dive into the teachings of a specific philosopher, exploring how they can teach us about topics like identity, like resilience, like happiness. Other times we look at it from a perspective how these philosophical ideas can be applied to current events or personal challenges. Think of it as a conversation, not just with me, but with the philosophers of the past. Those who have pondered those ideas for centuries and those questions as well. We'll be looking at life through their lenses, examining ideas that may shake us out of our comfort zones or challenge the way that we see ourselves. My hope is that each episode will leave you with something meaningful, whether it's a new perspective, a question to ponder, or even a small change you might want to make and add to your own life. And in a world that often feels chaotic, philosophy reminds us to slow down, to think deeply, and to live deliberately. Philosophizing with a hammer is about finding the courage to question what we believe and to live in a way that is truer to ourselves, just as these thinkers encouraged in their own time. So, if you're ready to explore, to question, and perhaps even to rethink the way you live, join me each week as we dive into the wisdom of the ages. Thank you for tuning in to the first episode. I'm excited to start this journey with you, and I look forward to exploring life's big questions together. Until next time, keep philosophizing, keep questioning, and remember, sometimes the answers are less important than the courage to ask. Stay tuned, and see you in the next episode on Philosophizing with a Hammer.